Hello?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Belinda Vang. I'm a student assistant at the Interculture International Student Services. This week's sponsors are Academic Affairs, CSB Campus Ministry, the CSB Sustainability Office, the CSB SJU Libraries, Eugene J. McCarthy Center for Public Policy and Civic Engagement, Fine Arts Programming, Interculture International Student Services, Joint Events Council, Koch Chair in Catholic Thought and Culture, Mathematics Department, PRISM, Reflection Action Dialogue, St. John's University School of Theology, and St. SJU Theology on Tap. This week we have a couple other events happening, so we encourage you to attend them. We have Outlier, the story of Katherine Johnson, Climate Justice for the Beloved Community, RAD, Drowning Voices, Can You Hear Me, and Saturday Church. This morning's presentation will be given by Mary Hinton, the CSB president. And here's a short description of what it's going to be about this morning. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote, "Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Our general communal goodwill is necessary, but not sufficient for us to become inclusive institutions. In order for our institutions to thrive, everyone in the community has to recognize that incidental efforts to support inclusion and diversity must become more intentional and deepen." Within this presentation, she will address the following questions. Why is general goodwill not enough? How can we deepen one another's understanding of challenges and opportunities surrounding inclusion on campus? As a leader, what she calls to do is to deepen in understanding. Here she is.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here for the teach-in session this morning. On Sunday evening, I watched the MLK Day sale ads pour into my email inbox. Shoes and clothes, linens, and more were suddenly on sale for one day. Thinking that perhaps I was being overly sensitive, I did a quick search, and sure enough, there is an intentional proliferation of sales around MLK Day. According to US News, quote, "If you've recovered from the holidays and are starting to crawl out of shopping hibernation, Martin Luther King Day is a good opportunity to ease back into deal hunting." Deal hunting. Some other emails I received asked, "What will you stream on the long weekend?" My heart literally ached. As most of you know, I grew up in North Carolina. And while my childhood was post-Jim Crow, the vestiges of that era loomed large over my life. Of course, for those of us experiencing it at the time, that was just life. There was a keen, visceral recognition of the powerlessness it engendered. While the phrase inequity was less powerful then than it is now, inequity was how we lived. Some inequity was quite explicit. Who had access to gifted and talented classes at my elementary school and who did not? Where people worked and what they did? Who shopped and worshiped and studied where they did? These were all framed by race and inequity in my childhood. The high school counselor who told me that Black women don't go to college perhaps remains my most poignant reminder of inequity. Those explicit inequities were reinforced by the daily subtle reminders of inequity. For example, all the Black families in my community had a phone number that began with 492, whereas all the white families in the community had a phone number that began with 438. So when I was 13, I clearly remember the delight with which we celebrated the passage of Martin Luther King Jr. Day as a national holiday. Many in my community believed it would never happen, my family among them. but it did, and it was a cause for rejoicing. It was a recognition of the injustice that had occurred and a call to strive for justice in the future. But you fast forward 35 years, and the understanding of MLK Day is muddy. What am I streaming? Where will I shop? There are those who believe that King's dream has been realized, and for others, their lived reality reminds us daily how much further we have to travel towards justice. Martin Luther King Jr. Day is about more than one man's legacy. On this day, in my view, we celebrate the movement he stood for as much as we celebrate the man. In fact, we are called to remember, on that day especially, that the work of justice must go on. It's not the same as other holidays because the dream has not been realized. The work is not yet complete. Those who care about justice and equity cannot take a day off. It's a day to use our collective voices to make a difference, and importantly, as King so often called us to do, to serve others. Student suggestions to hold teach-ins on that day, similar to what we did in 2015 or 16, or to create a day of service or all-day dialogue are well heard and work we've done in the past in these communities. When we think about these issues and how we continue to do the work of justice, we encounter the great difficulty of the civil rights and nearly every justice movement, getting everyone on board for a brighter future. But as we look towards the future, we are forced to ask ourselves, how do we know if we're going in the right direction? The direction that honors King's call, the direction that will not only bring forth his dream, but the dream of many who have been disenfranchised. What is the direction in which we should turn that responds to the work of justice? What do we need, and what we need from all of us is a deeper understanding of the work ahead. In April of 1963, King and other members of the civil rights movement staged an active and large demonstration in Birmingham. Unsurprisingly, King and his fellow justice seekers were arrested and jailed for protesting without a license, though they were ineligible for the license, so the government had determined that the protest was, in and of itself, going to be illegal. Several of the clergy in Birmingham criticized King for engaging in this illegal march and suggested that he needed to wait and use the existing legal system to forward the goals and ideals of civil rights. Now again, keep in mind that there was no mechanism by which the march could have been legal. As part of a response to criticism by clergy who lamented King's protest in Birmingham, Martin Luther King Jr. wrote Letter from a Birmingham Jail, an exquisite piece whose resonance seems unabated by the passage of time. The following excerpt is from his letter from a Birmingham jail. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. King was responding to people of goodwill who had been allies with the civil rights movement in some ways. Yet when the call was to deeper understanding, the need to disrupt the system in order to make progress, those allies disappeared and questioned his work. Letter from a Birmingham jail reveals some of the inner turmoil that King faced as the leader of a movement. So often, Martin Luther King Jr. is construed as a peacemaker who never experienced a sense of frustration and anger about the pace of change for civil rights in American society. When we reflect on King's work, we often forget or gloss over the reality that he lived his daily existence subjected to the tyranny against which he was protesting. Yet this quote, like many of his writings later in his life about economic inequality, reflect that King was frustrated by the fact that his allies, the people who purported to be with him in the struggle, were hampering progress. While King does not question the motives of these allies in the above quote, he points out how their lack of deep understanding about the issue the movement was facing were hampering progress. What his allies seemed to not understand was that he was dwelling within the difficulty he was working to eradicate, that he needed them to not only be an ally on paper or in manner, but to be with him in naming, confronting, and addressing the injustices he faced. Now let me state up front that what enables me to get out of bed in the morning is my unrelenting belief in the goodness of humankind. While I know intellectually that there are people of ill will in the world, I would find it personally incapacitating if I focused on that group of people. I could not get up in the morning if I questioned the motives of every person I encounter. So know from the outset that I'm only speaking with and about people of goodwill. But I also know that no cultural movement, no cultural shift forward around inclusion to support the work of justice, there is always going to be a natural point in the trajectory when we have to demand more from each other, demand more from people of goodwill. To be clear, people of goodwill are essential in the early stages of any movement, but especially movements that focus on the rights of others. When any oppressed or marginalized group begins to seek equity, the majority population is an essential and important ally. Tracy West called on us to remember the context within which King lived and the civil rights movement was born. She spoke about the hate that spawned the movement. When you live in that environment or in any environment of inequity and begin to seek justice, those people who provide a glimmer of kindness are so rare and are so important to the cause that they are welcomed in. You see, when you live your life feeling less than or so unlike the other, to be seen as fully human is a veritable life jacket when you're drowning. A kind word and a smile becomes evidence of your humanity. When your daily life is under assault, goodwill is so rare that it's all you ask for. At these early stages of the movement, there is often visible change that enables the work to continue. But as movements evolve, the demands on all those engaged in the movement evolve as well. As the group seeking justice makes small gains, large gains become an inevitable goal. Why should I settle for a portion of justice when I deserve full equity? Those who provide goodwill are asked for more than a smile. How will you support my humanity when your mere presence and smile are no longer enough? Will you be invested in my well-being when there may be a cost to you? Or the question we so often wrestle with in our community, will you sacrifice your comfort in order to be a witness to my humanity? From an organizational perspective, what I'm describing is a classic organizational change theory. So allow me to share my iceberg with you. What's most notable about icebergs is that they are incredibly large. They are massive. But 75 to 90% of an iceberg is underneath the water level. So while what you see is extraordinarily large, you're only seeing a fraction of what's actually in place. It's easy to make change on the visible part of the iceberg, or what in organizational theory we would call the artifacts. The artifacts are those rituals and ceremonies that allow us to act out what otherwise is hard to touch and comprehend. In doing so, we acknowledge our core values and begin to bond with one another. There is great goodwill, necessary goodwill at this level. But truly systemic change doesn't happen at that level. Rather, we have to help individuals move beyond how we articulate or view our artifacts to how we express our values and beliefs. Through shared values and beliefs, members of an organization develop a sense of direction that guides their day-to-day behavior. Here we talk about being Benedictine, dwelling in community, the Benny sisterhood. These messages about what we value and who we are may be expressed in artifacts, but they also get to a deeper part of our core. It's here that we begin to have conversations about slightly more complicated issues. How do we engage in difficult dialogue? What voices and ideas do we privilege? When the voice of the historically disenfranchised is heard, what happens to the voices of those who are used to being heard? How will those communities process their discomfort of no longer being the sole voice? And yet, we can still go deeper in our iceberg. True change, true systemic change, those moments when goodwill becomes terribly fragile and necessary but not sufficient, occurs when we begin to challenge the foundation of who and what we are. When we get to the very bottom of the iceberg and wrestle with those things we don't say, those things we don't feel we can articulate, the questions we feel we can't ask, the assertions we feel we can't challenge, the beliefs that we hold in both the lightest and darkest parts of our souls. It's here that goodwill is no longer sufficient. You see, goodwill alone doesn't demand that we ask those deep foundational questions, that we challenge those beliefs. But a deeper understanding asks us to look into the heart of who we are, to do the difficult internal work of self-examination. This is, quite literally, where a deeper understanding is essential. To return to the example with King, while the clergy supported him so long as the movement did not challenge their security or psychological safety, once his protest moved beyond their comfort level, they cautioned him to slow down, to allow time to take its course. King references the privilege of waiting in the letter from a Birmingham jail, writing, "All that is said here grows out of a tragic misconception of time. It is the strangely irrational notion that there is something in the very flow of time that will inevitably cure all ills. Actually, time is neutral. It can be used either destructively or constructively. I am coming to feel that the people of ill will have used time much more effectively than the people of goodwill. We will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the vitriolic words and actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence of the good people. We must come to see that human progress never rolls in on the wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts and persistent work of men willing to be co-workers with God. And without this hard work, time itself becomes an ally to the forces of social stagnation," end quote. To paraphrase, when you hold power and privilege, and I want to be clear that everyone has privilege at certain times in their lives, then it is easy to say, wait. To say, change takes time. To say, we need to be thoughtful. To say, we need to go slow. That is perhaps advice given in goodwill. Yet when we move beyond goodwill, we can no longer rely on the inevitability of time to assuage our troubles. Those who proclaim we must wait for justice or wait for equity or postpone inclusion are not fully understanding that time itself becomes its own punishment, that preservation of the status quo for any length of time perpetuates injustice. In the face of all this, in a community that I truly believe seeks to be its very best self, what am I as a leader called to do? What action are we called to take to move beyond goodwill, to move towards this deeper understanding? So as a leader, I can foster an institution that creates a place, a space, where it is safe for everyone to not only remember and witness to injustice, but a place that recognizes that without that witness, without that pain, there is no path forward. I often cite Edgar Schein when I describe what it means to be a learning institution. We know that organizational culture is an accumulation of prior learning. So how do we create a space here where we talk openly about our history and historical priorities or prior learning? How can we talk about how that history impacts what happens on campus today? How do we acknowledge the need to change culture without that feeling like a loss for people of genuinely goodwill? When people are fed up with the calling out of injustice, how do we shift concerns from the impact on self as opposed to concern about why the injustice happened? Or as King wrote, you deplore the demonstrations that are presently taking place in Birmingham, but I am sorry that your statement did not express a similar concern for the conditions that brought the demonstrations into being. In a college community, this is work for all of us to do. All of us must lead. How do we move the focus from fret and concern about the need to change to being more self-critical in order to grow? How do we hear from others whose experience may be dramatically different from our own? How do we hear new truths about our culture? Just because it's not the truth we want, just because it's not our experience, does not mean it's not true or it didn't happen. How can we hear those truths in a way that binds us together as opposed to alienate us? Perhaps what I am asking is that we see each other as more than a monolith, as more than one-dimensional people. You see, we are all, each of us, more than a single story. Every person on these campuses is complex and deep and wants their full humanity seen and witnessed to. Every single person. So I want to share a brief example of the danger of reducing people to a single story and how we reshape and revise history when we choose to have only one story in mind.
I come from a conventional middle-class Nigerian family. My father was a professor. My mother was an administrator. And so we had, as was the norm, live-in domestic help who would often come from nearby rural villages. So the year I turned 8, we got a new houseboy. His name was Fide. The only thing my mother told us about him was that his family was very poor. My mother sent yams and rice and old clothes to his family. And when I didn't finish my dinner, my mother would say, "Finish your food. Don't you know people like Fide's family have nothing?" So I felt enormous pity for Fide's family. Then one Saturday, we went to his village to visit. And his mother showed us a beautifully patterned basket made of dyed raffia that his brother had made. I was startled. It had not occurred to me that anybody in his family could actually make something. All I had heard about them was how poor they were, so that it had become impossible for me to see them as anything else but poor. Their poverty was my single story of them. Years later, I thought about this when I left Nigeria to go to university in the United States. I was 19. My American roommate was shocked by me. She asked where I had learned to speak English so well and was confused when I said that Nigeria happened to have English as its official language. She asked if she could listen to what she called my tribal music and was consequently very disappointed when I produced my tape of Mariah Carey. She assumed that I did not know how to use a stove. What struck me was this: she had felt sorry for me even before she saw me. Her default position toward me, as an African, was a kind of patronizing, well-meaning pity. My roommate had a single story of Africa, a single story of catastrophe. In this single story, there was no possibility of Africans being similar to her in any way, no possibility of feelings more complex than pity, no possibility of a connection as human equals. So that is how to create a single story. Show a people as one thing, as only one thing, over and over again, and that is what they become. It is impossible to talk about the single story without talking about power. There is a word, an Igbo word, that I think about whenever I think about the power structures of the world, and it is nkali. It's a noun that loosely translates to be greater than another. Like our economic and political worlds, stories too are defined by the principle of nkali. How they are told, who tells them, when they are told, how many stories are told, are really dependent on power. Power is the ability not just to tell the story of another person, but to make it the definitive story of that person. The Palestinian poet Mourid Barghouti writes that if you want to dispossess a people, the simplest way to do it is to tell their story and to start with secondly. Start the story with the arrows of the Native Americans and not with the arrival of the British, and you have an entirely different story. Start the story with the failure of the African state and not with the colonial creation of the African state, and you have an entirely different story.
Monolithic thinking of a single story. Every person on our campus community, majority students, students of color, high-income students, low-income students, the faculty, the administration, the staff, are made up of individual human beings, each with their own complex stories. Once we engage in acknowledging the need for culture change, for the existence of multiple stories within each of us, how then do we learn from and listen to something new? Personally, how do you learn and listen to something that interrogates our shared past and calls us to new ways of knowing and being and acting? And how do we learn about why we must be transformed as an institution so that it's not about that group, but it's about us collectively? How do we embrace that learning? My charge as a leader is to create an environment wherein that learning can take place. And once that learning has commenced, how do we shape institutional goals that align with where we would like to move towards? How do we change culture? And while I have long enjoyed Shine's research about culture change, on Monday, Donica shared a process that I will repeat now as a challenge to myself and to each of you. A challenge because all of us have the opportunity to lead in this work. Donica said we must remember, we must care, and we must take action. That's the work that we have to do to craft a full environment looking at the bigger picture, not only discrete experiences. I think of what Donica described on Monday as radical love within our community. So that's what I can do, create that learning community. Next, I would call on each of us to think about how you can engage in what I am now calling micro progress. Indeed, part of moving beyond goodwill is recognizing that goodwill and harmful microaggressions can peacefully and often do coexist. Microaggressions are those statements and questions that may seem innocuous on their own. However, the cumulative impact is quite detrimental. Some research has categorized microaggressions into microassaults, intentional actions or words to exclude a marginalized group, or micro-insults, which emerge from unconscious bias and serve to question or undermine the ability and strength of the object of that insult. And micro-invalidations occur when someone's lived experience is questioned or othered, or their perception of their lived experience is presumed inaccurate. On many days, one can experience each or a combination of all of these microaggressions. Marginalized groups experience microaggressions no matter where they are in our country and no matter how much power and authority they hold. So I would like to share the microaggressions that I face in the world, primarily outside of campus and primarily from my peers, people who I encounter in professional circumstances. Perhaps my favorite microaggression is when people ask me, how did you get your job? And it's not asked in a way of, I'd like to be a college president. It's asked in a way of, clearly you can't be qualified. Following that question, I often get, do you have a PhD? As if I've somehow worked my way into this position fraudulently. I'll often get, at gatherings of presidents, oh, are you a student? Or one of my favorites is, what do black women think about this issue? Sometimes I'll hear, there's no such things as microaggressions. I'm just not smart enough to understand what was really happening. Or I'll hear, that wasn't because of your race. That wasn't because of your sex. Many people have their own microaggressions that they've faced. And when others deny that experience, not only are they attempting to tell someone what their experience in the world is or should be, it denies that person's right and voice to share their experience. It reduces their humanity and privileges the humanity of the person who says it didn't happen. Microaggressions are harmful because of the daily exposure. The cumulative years of daily micro-insults make life difficult. It is the daily reminder that you are different and historically perceived as less than. It's the fact that you're most accepted as a person of color when people say they don't see color, and yet that means you're most accepted when people deny a significant part of who you are and what your experience has been. So what action can we take? Because words can lift up as much as they destroy, What if we counter microaggressions with microaffirmations? Microaffirmations are the intentional effort to affirm and lift up another. It can be as small as acknowledging the existence or humanity of a fellow human being. For example, sitting next to someone on the link you don't know demands very little of you, but it can be a life-enriching act for the other person. Finding something kind to say about a peer. Or as we go deeper, witnessing to another's pain by simply saying, I believe you, I hear you. Witnessing their humanity by saying, that must have hurt when you experienced that. And not trying to console by diminishing their experience or their hurt. These are small steps that move beyond goodwill because you are intentionally asking more and demanding more of yourself. The mere acknowledgement that microaggressions exist and have an impact is moving into a deeper level of understanding, especially if it's something that's not happened to you. As a leader on an infinitely smaller scale, there's a part of me that understands the narrow line that King was attempting to walk. On the one hand, he understood it was essential to build the biggest support network possible. He needed to get buy-in from as many people as possible, not only to change laws, but to provide him with a measure of protection as well. And yet, by having to nuance his message in order to get that buy-in, he found himself subjected to and being expected to tolerate shallow understanding from people of goodwill. So what does this mean in practice? Allow me to share an example. Quite often, college and university presidents are called upon to make statements about contemporary issues. This is an essential and important part of the platform which we have been afforded. And generally, it comes from a hopeful place when people ask for such a statement. However, as King expressed in this quote, at times these symbolic protests, an easy statement of a president, is not as effectual as needed to make deep change. And sometimes they take attention from more effective responses. King wrote, if I sought to answer all of the criticisms that crossed my desk, my secretaries would be engaged in little else in the course of the day, and I would have no time for constructive work. Further, these responses and statements that are shared often offer only broad understanding of difficult issues with which leaders from marginalized groups wrestle daily. They can become statements of shallow goodwill. For some, issues of racism, sexism, violence against women, classism, homophobia, and transphobia are more moral or academic issues only. They are issues with they wrestle when a major news item erupts, but they're not issues that are faced on a daily basis. For others, these are issues that frame portions of the entirety of our existence. They are emotional and they are raw. And sometimes it takes me time to respond to an issue as a detached president because I am a human being grieving a lack of justice. Because I engage in many different communities, the degree to which these issues overtake my life can vary. But I am, as you are, wholly unable to disengage my race and my sex in encounters that I have. So there are times when, while called on to speak, I may not be ready to respond, and I beg your patience with that as I grieve myself. But I have also had to learn when not to respond and rise to the bait. I have had to learn how to engage well beyond my comfort zone, and that is my task in this life, and it will be some of your task too. I had to learn that my most important conversations likely weren't with my friends in an echo chamber, but with people of ill will. Minimally, talking with detractors forced me to expand my worldview, taught me patience, and on some occasions may have shifted the perspective of these detractors. Now let me be clear, it is exhausting to talk with your detractors. It is unfair that I have to. It is unfair when you have to use your energy to justify your existence. I know what it is to walk into a room and be the only person who looks like me. I get that. But I also get that part of my task in this life is to walk into that room, to embrace my difference, and to speak my truth. I have to speak it in a way that others can hear it, and that's critically important. I have to speak it in a way that represents this community well, that represents my family well, that is faithful to all 1,755 Bennies that I serve. I have to speak it in a way that lifts up people of goodwill so that when I reach out to them to go deeper, they reach back out to me. I have to speak it to my friends, and I have to speak it to those who may choose to be enemies. I strive daily to speak my truth in such a way that were someone to listen, they couldn't tell who is in fact a friend and who is an enemy. And as my chief of staff reminded me, the challenge is sometimes about recognizing friends in a room when you are predisposed to only see enemies. It's about looking across difference. My chief of staff, Catherine, is a graduate of St. Ben's class of 2005. Catherine came to St. Ben's from a farm in southwestern Minnesota, and she had her own experiences of injustice at the College of St. Benedict. In fact, I witnessed her pain as a microaggression, a micro-insult, and a micro-invalidation was hurled at her only 2 months ago. But she is exactly right. One of the most important skills you have to develop is recognizing friends when they look an awful lot like someone you may have once thought was an enemy. You have to recognize people of goodwill and invite them and encourage them and embrace them as you journey to a deeper understanding. So how do we arrive at a deeper understanding about MLK Day? We invite one another into sustained dialogue. We wrestle together with these issues of equity and inclusion and justice. You see, when there is justice, I will click on the link in my email and shop. When there is peace, I will take a day and stream movies. When there is equity, we can take the day off. But today, there is work to be done. So let us do this work together in community. Let us experience radical love as we journey deeper. And I will just close with a quote from Joan Chittister's book for beginners, Insights into Benedictine Spirituality. Let us take care of one another. Let each one bear the weakness of the other. Let there be no doubt that we are obedient to one another. Let each of us do what is useful for the other instead of only what we seek for ourselves. May we love one another chastely and truly, and may we live in awe of God with us. And then let us ask ourselves, what could possibly be a better life than this? Thank you. Thank you. I'm happy to take a couple of minutes of questions. I know people have class that they need to get to. So, questions? Or comments?
I have a two-word comment, Mary.
Thank you. Chelsea, I saw your hand.
Yes, I just wanted to say thank you. I appreciated your words today, and especially when you talked about walking into the room and knowing what it's like to be the only one. I really resonated with that, and with everything you said, so thank you.
Thanks, Kelsey, and thank you for walking into so many rooms this week, Kelsey. Rooms that you didn't have to walk into. Rooms that weren't always easy to walk into, and you walked into them, and you not only walked in and were present with goodwill, you went deeper, and you chose to engage with people and help people engage with you, and you did that in St. Cloud at the Day of Breakfast. You did that at Tracy West Talk, and you're doing that today. So thank you for walking into this room. Other questions? Yes?
So I have a question that I kind of wanted to ask Dr. West, when she was here, but didn't have the opportunity. But one of the things she spoke about was the question of fear and how sort of brutalized that acts towards people will kind of bring about questions of fear. She talked about just sort of an overall sense of really sort of working for justice. And one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about lately is the links between a number of movements like Black Lives Matter, Palestinian rights, but most recently the sort of Angela Davis being having her social justice award rescinded. And so I guess what I'm wondering about is what sort of words of advice might you say in terms of addressing questions of fear? I'm here with my art class and wondering if there are suggestions that you might have in terms of addressing fear that is used by those in power.
There are moments when we are all afraid. And fear can be a healthy thing. It protects you. I'm guessing, I'm not a neuroscientist, but I'm guessing when our reptilian brain signals fear, it's in an effort to protect us. There are moments when if I poll the group, how many people have been afraid walking in a dark parking lot at night? Most of the women, and I'm making a broad statement here, would raise their hand. Dr. West talked about lots of groups that are disproportionately afraid. I have moments when I'm afraid, not because I have great privilege on these campuses. But I gave up. I used to bike a lot, and I largely gave that up this summer after I had 2 incidences with being called names riding down 75. And I gave it up because I didn't feel like it was a smart risk for me to take because I have a family. So some people would say the fear won in that instance. I would say my commitment to my family, my commitment to St. Ben's is bigger than my commitment to riding down 75. So I made a choice, and I own that choice. So you're going to have fear. What you can do is not use your voice in response to that fear. You have to speak up. You have to be smart. It was not smart for me. One of those situations was very uncomfortable, and it wasn't smart for me to have been out then. And I can't risk that. So you do live with fear. But you have to move beyond your fear as well. And for me, that was choosing something different, choosing to invest in my community, choosing to invest in my family. So as a leader, you have to acknowledge that sometimes people are afraid. And that's uncomfortable. But you can't walk away from it. That's why I said we often wrestle as a community, Andrew, with are we willing to allow our discomfort to be more important than someone else's discomfort? No one likes being uncomfortable, but some people dwell in that space all the time, and there's discomfort and fear. So can someone else be uncomfortable for 10 minutes just to be in solidarity with someone who's uncomfortable for most of their lives? That seems like a small trade-off. But fear is real. And I'm sorry, I don't have more uplifting words. But fear is real, and you have to work through it, and you have to make good decisions about it. Other questions? Yes, Happy?
I was really struck by what you said about time, and that we can't just kind of say it'll happen, believe all. And that's something I certainly struggle with the Catholic Church in terms of how do you balance really listening to the opponents, giving them time to grow without giving in? Do you have any advice for that balance of, yes, we have to be impatient, we have to continue to work, but how do we work in a way that doesn't further alienate?
Coretta Scott King, who we don't talk about nearly enough, and who I would say we wouldn't have MLK Junior Day if we didn't have Coretta Scott King, so I want to highlight the women in the movement, as Dr. West did. But she said we must be patiently impatient. And it's not a choice between we either do this today or it doesn't happen at all. It's how do you get enough people to realize the urgency, to realize that time is punishing for some people. For students at St. Ben's and St. John's, we have 4 years here to transform their experience and be transformed by us. There is a great urgency, and you need more people to get on board. And so it's going to take some time, but I think, in my experience, when you can speak to and see the heart of another human being, then I think you can be transformed, and I think it accelerates time. And I know that sounds very soft, but when I think about that incident that came to mind in responding to your question, what I wanted to say to that person who said that to me, do you know what's in my heart? And what's in your heart? Because without that, without trying to see each other, we are never going to utilize time appropriately. We're never going to make that progress. So what I'm asking us as a community to do is to not see monoliths, to not see single stories, but to get into the spirit and the heart and the humanity of each other. Because I think that radical love will accelerate the process a little bit more. I don't think that's the only way I know to accelerate the process, is to be patiently impatient, as Coretta Scott King said. I know, how are you? Good to see you. I'll take one last question, because I know we have to end for class. I think we're at the end.
I guess my question is, how do we engage with these issues, over breaks and stuff? Because it's much easier to deal with these issues when we're here and we're invited to these kind of dialogues and there's opportunities to engage in these things. But I find it much harder when I go back home and I'm kind of thrown back into my old home life to really engage with these kind of issues.
It is really hard. Breaks are an incredibly vulnerable time for students, I think. I I would say use technology, and I didn't have this we didn't have the internet when I was in college, so we certainly didn't have social media. Use social media to stay in touch and to keep the dialogue going. Find webinars, find events in your community where you can go and serve. When you go and serve another human being, you are engaging in the work of justice and equity. So I would say try those things. Use social media for good. For good. Use social media for good. Serve another and find communities there. But there is vulnerability. For some folks, there's vulnerability when you go home. And I recognize it and I see it. When I didn't fit in, and some of you have heard me say this, I didn't fit in at the New England liberal arts school I went to. But by virtue of going there, when I went back home to rural North Carolina, I didn't fit in there anymore either. And you sometimes feel like you don't have a home, like there's not a place where you can be seen. So I want to acknowledge and honor that difficulty and say you may have to dig deeper and find other groups in that community. But if you go and volunteer, you will find people who will engage these issues with you. Thank you all for being here today. I hope